Yeah. Hi, Clark. I'm really glad to have you today on the podcast. We met a few months ago at an event from French Tech Munich, where you spoke a little bit about innovation and tech startups in Europe. Maybe you can tell us a little bit more about yourself. When I checked you out, I saw that you yourself also at some point were a founder. So maybe you can tell us a little bit more about where you came, where you're coming from and what you're doing at the foundation.
Super. Yeah, it's a pleasure, Saskia. I'm really happy to be on the podcast. My name's Clark Parsons. I am an American, as you can hear. I've been in Berlin for 27 years. So, in my first life, I was a journalist and then worked a lot in media and tech and IT, and had a startup from 2005 to 2008, um, which a partner and I then sold. And for about 7 years after that, I ran a business school for the creative industries in Berlin called the Berlin School of Creative Leadership. So we were taking people who had not studied much, but who were building startups in the agency, media, marketing, publishing, music, film, TV world, and teaching them leadership skills so that they could try and lead and inspire big teams. And I really enjoyed that, but I kind of wanted to get back to the tech roots. And about 8 years ago, I met the man who became the chairman of my foundation. A small circle of founders and funders from the German ecosystem were very frustrated with the pace of change in the digital and tech worlds. And the politicians told them, well, we don't really know what you want. There are trade federations, but they have a lot of American companies in there too. So if you have any ideas about what Europe and Germany need to finally be a global player in the digital world, then you tell us. So that's what I've been doing for 8 years now. I've been the managing director of the Internet Economy Foundation, and we're out there trying to fight the good fight and help tell the politicians what they should do.
I think especially now it's a really important fight. We see it all the time. I think one fact that stuck with me from your keynote at the La French Tech event was the fact that Europe investors are really, really risk averse, which is a big issue because then the more innovative products, solutions don't find any investors here in Europe, and a lot of startups have to go to the US to be able to build up their products. Did I
It's true.
get that right?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think I mean, and we know a lot of venture capitalists, of course, and some are on my board. Um, and so they're the people taking the most risks in the European ecosystem. So I'm actually surrounded by the people who are doing the risky investments, at least from the point of view of Europeans. I think one of the problems is actually we always talk about startups, but you have to remember where these things are going to end. And usually a startup is either sold to a bigger company, or if it has a great success, it'll do an initial public offering. It will go public. It will start issuing stock. Of course, most startups don't even make it. The math is
Mhm.
designed to withstand failure and have a lot of things fail, but the things that work pay for the rest of the fund. So there's risk calculated in already. But I think one of the problems for Europeans is that because we do not have an exit market the way America does. We don't have anything approaching the size of Wall Street, and the corporates in Europe are not as active in acquiring small and medium companies that are coming up. So as a result, if you're investing, you kind of need much more of a sure thing, I guess is kind of what I would sort of, if I could make a cultural generalization, you
Mhm.
tend to want to see a lot more track record, a lot more sales, a lot more proof before you just jump.
Yeah, and it's a little bit tricky. I mean, we discussed just before Marvel Fusion, a Munich-based startup in the green tech field, is going to the US to be able to build up a test facility because nobody in Europe wanted to invest. They got zero offers within Europe and are getting 150 million euros from the Colorado state and the university there to build up their facilities. And I mean, I would say that the transition and the focus on green energy is way stronger in Europe and in the politics in Europe than in the US, and still they're getting money from there. So it's a little bit sad to be losing so good innovations.
Yeah, it is, especially because
What's yeah,
yeah. I was going to say, as a European, we have the
no, no,
feeling
go
like
on.
we were there first. um, the
Hmm.
the U.S. is leapfrogging because of a program called the Inflation Reduction Act, which the Biden administration passed, and they took a totally different approach than the European one. The European one is very um, how to put it. Um, it's very specific in terms of how it wants to issue money and how you can qualify for money, and there's programs, and it's very sort of bureaucratic. Um, and the American one is simply tax credits to spur investment. And so it's a lot quicker, it's a lot nimbler, and it's gigantic. It's a lot bigger than Europe is actually putting on the table. And as a result, there's been an incredible explosion of activity in investments in the last year. Europe was leading in green tech and climate tech, and the number of startups, but the US is now zooming because of investments you see like this. I mean, the problem that a Marvel has, remember, our venture capital funds just aren't big enough to make an investment of
Hmm.
150 million. That's the size of most funds in Europe. And you can't bet the
Yeah.
whole fund on one investment. You have to spread your risk. So we're kind of the victim. You know, we've achieved so much in Europe, but we're still sort of mathematically about 20 years behind in terms of the size of our funds compared to the US. The US now has $1 billion, $2 billion funds, and as a result, somebody can write a check for 100 million, 150 million. We'll get there in 20 years, but unfortunately, we're structurally just too far behind.
Yeah, and even if we get there in 20 years, where will the US be in 20 years? So the gap won't close itself, I think. Um, I mean, in order to be able to do something of the size of what the US is doing, we would need something more from the Europe part. And I feel like within Europe, I mean, I'm French, so I know that France, Macron, and La French Tech is doing a lot in France. In Germany, we're trying to do, but I feel like less is happening. But on the European level, I feel like each country is trying to fight a little bit against the others, but we're not getting together. What do you see on this side?
Um, I, I agree. I mean, the big problem, sort of the macro problem that we have, is that um, in Europe, the family offices are investing a lot, which is a nice way of saying the oldest, richest families in Europe are benefiting from tech and investing. And it's a free world. So congratulations to them. Thank you for investing in tech, or rather, they're investing in the funds that are investing in tech. So they're
Mm-hmm.
what you'd call the limited partners. Also, corporate venture capital in Europe has been stepping up. Um, and the state is the number one source. So the European Investment Fund out of Luxembourg, I think they're a limited partner in more than 600 European venture capital funds. So you can't blame the state, and you can't blame Europe's old money. Where I point
Mm-hmm.
the finger is the pension funds and the insurance companies. That's the number one source of capital that flows into the US system. So we always ask, gee, why do the Americans have more money? It's because they've set up over decades a system in which much more capital flows into their innovation economy as investments from us, the little people, every month,
Mm-hmm.
putting a little money aside through different type of uh, you know um, programs where you can invest in a pension fund or you can invest something, um, and this money all flows to Silicon Valley. So the pension funds in the U.S. are the number one source of funding for those investment funds. That's about, I mean, ironically, the US and Europe have about the same amount of money in the mattress, if you to put it. It's
Mm-hmm.
about 7 trillion each that our pension systems have. But in Europe, aside from a few countries like the Netherlands and Sweden, where the system is a little different and more of this money flows, Germany, ugh, they're almost investing nothing from the pension system in Germany, and we don't really have a pension system based on stocks the way maybe the Swedes do. So, ironically, it's funny. This week, the opposition party, Christian Democrats in Germany, somebody finally floated the idea from their party. Maybe we need a stock based pension system like the rest of the world has. And, when we wonder where the capital is. And unfortunately, the leader of the party shot it down, said, ugh, speculation, all these sort of crazy words. But, then we wonder why we don't have any capital and why a fund in Berlin, backed by the California Teachers Pension Fund, is investing in our startups. It's a bit of a strange world. So I point the finger at the pension funds. I don't mean to be mean about it, but it's just, yeah, culturally, legally, we just have a lot of work to do to get our own capital invested into our system, and that is how we're going to catch up.
And what points you are maybe already behind the scenes working on? You already discussed that some politicians are speaking in this direction, but the ideas are shut down. What are maybe spoiler alerts that you can already tease from your side?
That's a great question. I mean, there's a word in German, they call it the Aktienrente. It's, trying to make investing another piece of everyone's individual future pension. Because we all realize that the current German system is just not working. It's not returning anything like other countries are returning. And in fact, just a couple months ago, the UK passed a law that I think their pension funds have to invest up to 5%, which is a huge amount. In the US, they invest under 1% into
Mm-hmm.
venture capital. So I would say there's some things moving. There's a word that everyone that works at the European level hates to hear. It's a phrase. It's called capital markets union. It's sort of that. It's the great white whale out there that Europe is trying to pursue. Because we know that if we would somehow, as you mentioned it, we're all kind of working against each other. If we would somehow band together and have one market for our capital and have one big pool, then we could be as strong or stronger than the US in terms of how much capital we could invest in our own innovation. But right now, we're too disjointed. And so the great white whale of Brussels is Capital Markets Union. And just this past half year, everybody in power, and I mean Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, Charles Michel, the vice president, the people running the European Investment Bank, Werner Hoyer. So all of the people in charge of setting the agenda said last March, hey, we really need to come back to that idea about capital markets union. We really haven't gotten it done. So it's on the agenda, but I think it's going to take a lot of, unfortunately, many, many years of um, good ideas finding their way to Brussels, getting enacted, changing the culture. It's not going to be quick or easy, but I've learned that, when you're working in the startup sector, getting first you take the big rocks and you knock them down into smaller rocks and you knock those into smaller. I mean, there's always something to work on to improve our ecosystem.
Maybe a little bit of a different direction, but I thought about the AI Act that is also being worked up on the European level. And I just had a discussion with a colleague of mine who is working for Casablanca, who is an AI startup we're working for. And here the founder is also saying, hey, if it's not happening soon, then we're also going to lose all the AI startups in Europe. So I know it's a little bit uh, off track from our topic,
No, not at
but
all. Same topic.
what's your your take on that? How can we get there, make it quicker?
Yeah, we have, this is where, the Germans always have that phrase about how you have two hearts in your chest. There's two there's two wishes here at play in Europe that are kind of clashing. One is we see artificial intelligence and all of the advances. We see that much of the talent that has developed these algorithms and is working in Silicon Valley are Europeans. So we see that we have all the brains and all the research that we need, and we're frustrated because where's our capital? Where are our startups? We have a lot, but we see a lot more developing um, just in terms of sheer numbers in Silicon Valley right now. So on the one hand, we're trying to go, 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 yeah, and there's some great encouraging things. You know, in Paris there's Mistral, in Germany there's Aleph Alpha, and now Nionic. So there's teams in Europe at the highest levels that are trying to get large language models made in Europe going. So there's hope. So on the one hand, we're all pushing and we think it's important, and almost every day a different ministry in a different country announces another 100 million for research or something. So on the one hand, we're pushing. On the other hand, Europe has realized that if anybody is going to regulate big tech, it's going to be Europe, because America is just sort
Mhm.
of structurally paralyzed and is not going to do anything. To some degree, they kind of like the fact that they have all these monopolists, you know, with an American flag. Um, and as a result, Europe has been doing a lot of things to regulate data, to regulate, you know, personal data. We have GDPR. We have the Digital Markets Act tomorrow. We're recording this in early September. Tomorrow, September 6th, will be a huge announcement about who's a gatekeeper and how Europe is going to regulate them. So Europe has discovered its ability to regulate big tech and is kind of fallen in love with that. And over the course of a couple years now, it has been working to regulate AI and put some basic rules in place, which is a totally fine tendency. But you and I have seen that the AI industry is moving so fast, there's no way that any regulation is going to keep up or get ahead of it. And as a result, European teams are sitting here saying, hey, wait a minute, I'm trying to develop something and compete, and yet I have to keep an eye on Brussels because, you know, this practice might be illegal or that might be illegal, and so Europe's two priorities: one, to get tech sovereignty, and two, to um, have its own values in big tech, especially around privacy. And the right to your data, which is a European fundamental right. This is like, Americans don't even realize this, but for a European, you have the right to your data, and that's enshrined in law, and it's real. And so, of course, we have to back that up with legislation. So, but these two things are always clashing, especially on the AI Act, because what does AI need to function? Data. We need gigantic pools of data. And yet, we're in the continent that is trying to make sure that private, personal data doesn't get sucked up in these training models. And so we have two of our values are clashing right now. I'm afraid that the one of caution and regulation is definitely winning and costing us our speed and costing us our risk taking. We have to find a way to get a better balance at that, because unfortunately, the Americans and the Chinese don't seem to have any kind of scruples about um, slowing themselves down with worries about ethics right now.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, one part that we discussed at the same event from La French Tech was also, yeah, where to find the data for AI. And it's a bit tricky in Europe to find good data that you are able to use without breaking any laws or breaking any future laws. Um, yeah, keep in mind what's currently applicable and what will be applied tomorrow is a little bit tricky. What are maybe some recommendation or advice you would give founders um, in the deep tech field? What should a founder in this time point of time be looking at?
That's a great question. I think, you know, when you're doing a startup, most people are thinking about, I need to find my product market fit. The first 10 hires, usually you don't think about hiring a policy person. But I really do recommend anybody who's working in the data space or trying to train an AI model or doing any of these things should have a conversation with somebody on the policy front, an expert, a consultant, you name it. Just have a free conversation with a lawyer or anybody who knows their way around policy, because someday, and we see this in some sectors already, being respectful of the regulations put in place to keep AI ethical and trustworthy, that's going to become a plus when you're marketing to consumers,
Mm-hmm.
especially, and to businesses. Businesses are very concerned about the safety of their data. Um, so we actually created a community at the um, at Iconomy, a company where I'm active, that is a digital consultancy. We called it Privacy Tech because we wanted to highlight how many great companies there are, especially in Europe, who are trying to abide by privacy ethics and privacy respecting practices and build technology companies around that. So if you're a founder, I would say, don't be afraid to explore a business model that might have to 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 deal with data, but just educate yourself a little bit about um, what the regulations are or could be, so that you can potentially um, turn this aspect into an advantage in your marketing and in the way you build stuff. Because honestly, there's legislation cooking right now. ChatGPT, OpenAI, the company behind it. It's very clear that a lot of these companies, and also um, the company that built Stability Diffusion, that's doing a lot of the generative AI in the visual space, a lot of these companies have been scraping the web, just grabbing whatever's out there to train their models, which is great for training models. But if you're an author of a novel and you had your entire text scraped by an AI bot, so that when somebody now types in, write me a poem in the style of Saskia, and something comes out that has been clearly looking at your copyrighted material, I can understand why a musical artist or an author or a researcher or somebody who's devoted their life to putting their information or their entertainment or their copyrighted good out there would be very upset that somebody was just coming along scraping the web and training a model on it. I think you're going to see a lot of activity in the next year or two in which we get a lot more guardrails in place so that AIs can't just be trained sort of wild west on whatever's out there, but there has to be some respect. I mean, look at the battles we've been fighting for 10, 15 years between Google or Meta and the news publishers about the fair use of their content and how to compensate them,
Mm-hmm.
because we all like to go to these social feeds to see what's in the news, but somebody's got to get paid to write that stuff. And if that business model is totally gone because of piracy, if you will, then we have a problem also for democracy. So I think if I'm a founder, um, I would need to be very clear upfront about, if, especially in the AI space, I mean, um, I would be very clear about if I'm going to be gathering data, what are my sources? Can I get data that I feel really comfortable with? Can I even annotate to the users how this is going to happen? I mean, a lot of the leading companies in the European AI space, like an Aleph Alpha, are actually quite proud of saying, we're not going to scrape the web. We're actually building large language models so that private companies could put their proprietary data into our model and train it, and then have their own sort of internal proprietary chat or interactions or knowledge base. I mean, almost every week now there's a new announcement. I think Bosch announced with Aleph Alpha that it's going to be doing Bosch GPT. In other words, the employees of the Bosch company could someday interact with their entire gigantic knowledge base because it's been fed
Mm-hmm.
into a large language model. So we have some potential structural and, dare I say, marketing advantages if our founders can find ways to use that and capitalize on it. But it can be frustrating if you're a founder, because a founder in California is usually not really thinking about how can I make sure that my data sources are clean, or that that the attribution is trustworthy. But these things are all coming, so it's best to get ahead of it.
Yeah, I think it's, yeah, especially in Europe. I mean, I have lots of friends and even young people where when you speak about AI that are already scared about what's going to happen with their data, with the copyright. I especially had a friend who exactly discussed the example that you had about, hey, I have a blog where I post a lot of insights about the industry, and now an AI can just copy my writing style and go on without me having any recognition. So I think there is um, a lot of people scared, and I think being on the safer side and following regulation will be very helpful, especially in Europe. Um, what learnings or advices would you give? We spoke a little bit more about AI and more for the deep tech industry, maybe even for the next investment round for Marvel Fusion, for instance. How should they try to get the attention of European investors?
That's a great question. Well, they certainly got the attention of European investors by going to the US, because those are the kind of alarm signals that are making everyone in Berlin and Paris and Brussels and elsewhere re examine their plans for how they can fund our own tech ecosystem. Um, so I think, I mean, what's interesting is if you're a founder now, you know, when I started a company in 2005, there was very, very little in terms of venture capital funds that could have worked with us or funded us. In fact, we were self funded, we never took venture capital. Um, Nowadays, there's an explosion. I mean, there's been an absolute explosion in the European tech space of very specific funds. And I think what we, to some degree, have is almost just an information um, shortage for founders. Because if you're a founder, let's say in Lisbon, you might not know that sitting in Helsinki is a fund dedicated to exactly your type of tech. Um, and and um, and this happens all the time now. I mean, we're seeing more and more dedicated type of funds who are focused on specific types of tech. So I would say most founders, before you, I mean, if you think you're going to do something that will require some kind of capital in the next year or two, start educating yourself or researching specialty funds, because I think this is going to be really the key for European deep tech is is that our startups get matched to all of the amazing new funds that are coming out there that are specializing in very specific things. I mean, we've seen funds literally for fusion, we've seen funds for quantum. There's many funds now dedicated to almost every vertical you can think of in what you would call the deep tech space. Saskia, you've gone
Sorry,
dark. Have is my
I'm
feed gone? There
you.
We go. Yeah, I didn't know if my feed was gone.
Okay.
I can.
No,
No
I could
problem.
hear you until the end. So
Cool.
the recording should be fine.
Super.
Maybe one final question, and maybe this one is a tricky one, but you speaking about retirement plan made me thought about. For me personally, last year I did a finance plan, started to see, okay, where do I want to invest, where do I want to put my money for my retirement, and so on. So, me as a private person, can I do something to help startups?
That's a great question. You can, of course, do something that every startup is desperate for, which is you can be a customer. Um, if you look at any poll or survey of startup founders, the first thing that they would like to get that's on top of their list, of course, is capital, yeah, venture capital or some kind of finance. But the second thing on every list, and the thing that is incredibly important, is customers, because that actually validates your entire business. That's the thing you're desperate for. So every
Mhm.
one of us can think about, how am I searching? Um, there's alternative search engines out there made in Europe. What map solution am I using? What video conferencing solution am I using? what mail solution am I using? We have Proton Mail sitting in Switzerland for maps. We have many providers. Um, so there's an entire stack of technology beyond Microsoft Office or the Google Suite or others, um, just to name a couple. And so many of these European companies are desperate or would love to have you just become a customer and recommend it. And not just in the B2B space, but also in the B2C space. So I know it sounds kind of like a cliche, but the greatest thing you could do as a private person is just start making yourself aware of how many times you are right now using the default product of one of the big four. Um, because, well, I paid for Amazon Prime and they offered me music, so I guess I'll take it. Instead of thinking about all the great streamers, Deezer, Spotify, SoundCloud, Adagio in Berlin for classic. I mean, in almost every product that has a default offering from the big tech companies, there are wonderful European products, often better, often much better. The reason
Mhm.
that they aren't getting to you is because there's structural hurdles along the way to making it possible for you to switch or have an option to use them or even to discover them. So these things aren't getting to you because they're bad. They're usually not reaching you because they don't have the budget, or they don't have the structural power to break through the noise of you being offered all of these default settings. So I would encourage everybody to really think about, you know, what's my search engine? What's my mail provider? Do I really want every social media post belonging to Mark Zuckerberg in perpetuity? There's a lot of things you can do to sort of create your own personal tech stack that is independent. And not only will you discover much better products, I mean, there's great newsletters like Product Hunt where you can find the latest and greatest new technology every day. There's literally dozens of companies vying to get voted up to the top of Product Hunt. So there's a whole culture out there of discovery of great new tech products. So there's no shortage of them. But I would encourage everybody to get out there and try and discover a few new things every few weeks or months, because you'll not only feel better, you'll not only have much cooler and better products usually, but you'll also be doing something for the ecosystem. And that's exactly what the founders want most of all, is users and revenue.
I think that's a great advice, and that's something that we oftentimes forget. I mean, it may be a little bit lazy because everything else we already know without having to look for it, to have a deeper search to find a European solution. I think that's also something that in France is done a lot. I know that if I order something on Amazon, my dad will be the first to tell me, why did you order that there? You would have been able to find it on this website here and here. So yeah, that's something that we in Germany might have to do a little bit more. I think in Germany we are a little bit less looking for the English word for French one.
What's
Um, yeah,
what,
patriotic
what's the
maybe.
French word? Patriotic, yes, yeah.
Chauvin.
I sometimes say chauvinistic, yeah, chauvinistic, in a good
Mm-hmm.
way,
Yeah,
positive
exactly.
chauvinism. Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
But you bring up a wonderful point. So many of us think about, um, where did my salad or my steak come from? Was it a local, or was it from far away? Was it processed, or was it artisan? So we're thinking about the provenance of our food. We're thinking about shopping at a local bookstore. We're thinking about going to a local clothing outlet, maybe even secondhand, or a local designer. So we're thinking these thoughts throughout the day about the soft drinks and the dinner and the books and the clothes and so many things. And yet, when it's time to choose our mail client, or our search engine, or so many other technology pieces, we're not thinking the same way. And I think it would be a
Mm-hmm.
great revolution if consumers everywhere started thinking a lot more about, hey, I need to make an active, informed choice um, about the technology I'm using every day.
Yeah. Consume local also for tech solutions.
Exactly.
I think that's a great way to finish the podcast. Thank you very much for joining today and for taking time to answer my questions. I think we have very important insights and inputs. I'm excited to see what our listeners think. Thank you very much for joining.
Thanks so much, Saskia. And thanks to all the listeners for sticking with us.